The music hall was buzzing with excitement that evening. People filled the rows of seats, whispering in anticipation about the young pianist who had been making quiet waves in the town. No one knew much about her life, except that she had an unusual talent and played with a depth of feeling that seemed far beyond her years. She wasn't someone who chased fame or posted videos online. Her music simply spoke for her. In the front row, a world-famous pianist sat with a calm but curious expression. He had traveled across the country to see her, driven by a mix of skepticism and challenge. Stories of her talent had reached his ears, and although he had heard rumors about prodigies before, he wanted to see for himself whether this young pianist was really worth the talk. He wasn't used to being unsure of his place in the music world, but something about this girl's reputation intrigued him. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, observing quietly as the lights dimmed and the room fell into a hushed anticipation. Backstage, the young pianist was quietly setting up her sheet music, though she knew she didn't really need it. She had memorized everything, every note, every pause, every rise and fall of the melody. Her fingers brushed over the keys as if greeting old friends, her expression calm but focused. She didn't look nervous. In fact, she looked almost serene, as if she were stepping into a room she belonged in rather than preparing for a performance that could define her future. The audience grew silent as the lights dimmed even more and a soft spotlight fell on the piano. A few people whispered her name, unsure of what to expect. Some were excited, hoping to witness a true prodigy. Others were skeptical, thinking maybe this was just another overhyped story. No one, not even the famous pianist, could have predicted what would happen next. The young pianist took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She listened to the faint hum of the room, the quiet shuffle of people finding their seats, the distant murmur of voices from the lobby. To her, all these sounds were part of the music in their own way. She opened her eyes and sat straight, her fingers hovering above the keys, ready to bring the notes to life. From the back of the hall, the famous pianist watched intently. He was known for his technical brilliance, for the speed of his fingers and the complexity of his compositions. He had faced challenges before, had played in countless competitions, and had always been confident in his skill. But tonight was different. He felt a strange mix of excitement and uncertainty. There was something about the simplicity of her approach, the way she seemed so connected to the music itself rather than the applause, that unsettled him. He didn't like feeling unsettled, but he couldn't look away. The performance began quietly, almost shyly. The first few notes were soft, gentle, almost hesitant, and the audience leaned in. There was a beauty in her simplicity, a clarity in the way she touched each key. The room seemed to hold its breath. People who had come expecting a show of flashy skill suddenly realized they were witnessing something more intimate, more real. It wasn't just a performance. It felt like a conversation, like the piano was telling a story and she was guiding them through it. As the music continued, the young pianist's confidence grew. She didn't need to show off. She didn't need to play the fastest notes or the most complicated chords. She simply let the music flow through her. Each phrase carried emotion. Each pause gave the listener a chance to breathe. Each note seemed to hang in the air just long enough to leave an impression. The audience began to lean forward, drawn in by the sincerity and power of her playing. Meanwhile, the famous pianist felt a stir of surprise. He had expected to see technical brilliance, but this was something different. This was artistry. This was heart. He could feel it in the way she phrased the melody, the subtle shifts in rhythm, the gentle swells of sound that seemed to rise and fall like waves. He had faced many talented musicians, but this felt personal, as if the music itself had chosen her as its messenger. For the first time in a long time, he felt the thrill of not knowing what would happen next. The whispers in the audience grew quieter, replaced by a focused silence. Every eye was on her, every ear attuned to the subtle changes in tempo, every heart sensing the emotion she poured into each chord. People who had come to witness a competition found themselves caught up in something more profound. There were no flashy gestures, no dramatic theatrics, just the young pianist and her music. And yet, it was enough to make the entire room feel alive. After a few moments, she paused, letting the last note linger, almost hesitant to let it go. The silence that followed was heavy with awe. Some people didn't even breathe. They were waiting for the next phrase, but there was none. She had made her point with a quiet power that no one could ignore. She opened her eyes and looked up briefly, acknowledging the audience with a small, respectful nod, and then sat back slightly, as if releasing a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. From the back of the hall, the famous pianist leaned forward slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He realized that this young pianist was not here to compete in the usual sense. She was here to communicate, to connect through music in a way that transcended skill or rivalry. And in that moment, he knew that tonight, something significant was happening, something that could not be measured simply by applause or speed or technical ability. It was a quiet triumph, and he felt a mixture of admiration and challenge rise within him. The performance continued, each piece more expressive than the last, each movement showing her depth and understanding of the music. The audience remained captivated, some moved to tears, others sitting in stunned silence. Every note she played seemed to reveal a part of her story, her experiences, her emotions, and her understanding of life. People began to sense that this was more than talent, it was a gift, one that demanded respect and attention. As the young pianist finished her set, the room erupted in applause, though it felt different from the usual cheering. This was genuine, heartfelt appreciation for someone who had touched them through music. The famous pianist remained seated, thoughtful, almost reluctant to join the applause. He had seen many performances, but this one had unsettled him in the best way possible. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about recognizing a talent that could not be ignored. Backstage, the young pianist quietly packed her sheet music, her expression calm but satisfied. She hadn't needed to prove anything to anyone, yet she had conveyed everything she wanted through her performance. She didn't know that the famous pianist had been watching her with more than just curiosity. He had been watching her with a mix of respect and challenge. This was the beginning of something that neither of them could yet fully understand, a moment that would set the stage for a meeting neither would forget. Outside the hall, as the audience filed out, many were still talking in hushed tones about the young pianist. Some couldn't remember the last time they had felt so moved by a performance. The stories would travel, of course, but for those who had been there, it was more than just a story. It was a reminder of why they loved music in the first place, for its ability to connect, to inspire, and to surprise. The famous pianist stayed behind a moment longer, watching her disappear behind the curtains. He didn't know exactly what this encounter would lead to, but one thing was clear. He had been challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated, and somewhere deep down, he was eager to see how this story would continue. The young pianist had made her point without a word, without confrontation, without even trying to compete. She had simply played, and her music had spoken for her in a way that left everyone, including him, speechless. After the performance, the young pianist returned to her small, quiet apartment. The city outside was alive with noise and movement, but inside, her space was calm, filled with the faint scent of old books and polished wood. She placed her sheet music on the shelf and leaned against the piano for a moment, letting herself breathe. Each performance, no matter how well it went, required her full energy and concentration. Tonight had been no different. Her fingers tingled with the traces of every note she had played, and her mind replayed each movement as if she were still performing for the hall full of people. She thought about the audience's reactions, the way some had leaned forward, completely absorbed in her music. She smiled softly to herself, not because she wanted praise, but because she felt the quiet connection she had shared with everyone in that room. Music, to her, was never about winning applause or showing off skill. It was about speaking without words, about touching hearts and leaving something behind in the silence after the last note. Meanwhile, the famous pianist was back in his own hotel room, pacing slowly. He had not expected to feel unsettled by anyone's performance, yet tonight had shifted something inside him. He had faced talented musicians before, but this young pianist had brought something completely different to the table. There was no arrogance, no effort to compete, only a pure expression of music. That purity had struck him in a way he could not ignore. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring at the city lights, replaying the performance in his mind. He knew instinctively that he had to see her again, not as a competitor, but as someone whose talent demanded attention. The next few days were quiet for the young pianist. She practiced each morning, her routine steady and disciplined. She would play for hours, exploring different pieces, some old and familiar, others new and challenging. Her neighbors occasionally passed by, hearing faint strains of music drifting through the walls. But few knew that behind that door, a remarkable talent was quietly honing her craft. The city continued to bustle, but for her, the world existed mainly in the spaces between the notes. She had not thought much about the famous pianist since that evening. She respected him, of course, as one would respect someone who had achieved so much. But she did not chase attention or recognition. Her focus remained on the music itself, on the discipline that had brought her this far. Yet she felt a quiet awareness that her performance had left an impression, and part of her was curious about what might come next. There was no need to rush, no need to anticipate. She knew the music would guide her when the time was right. On the other hand, the famous pianist could not let go of the memory of her performance. Each day, he found himself thinking about the subtle control she had over her music, the way her emotions seemed to flow naturally through her fingers. He replayed the pieces in his mind, analyzing, wondering, comparing, yet always returning to the simple truth. She had a gift he had rarely seen, and he needed to meet her again. It was no longer about proving superiority. It was about understanding, about witnessing the depth of her talent and learning from it in ways he could not have imagined. He sent a polite, carefully worded note to the music hall, requesting to meet her for a private session. He wanted to discuss music, perhaps exchange ideas, but he also wanted to challenge himself, to see how someone so young and unassuming could hold such power in her hands. When the young pianist received the request, she hesitated only briefly. She recognized the name, of course, and she understood the weight behind the invitation. But she also understood that this was an opportunity to connect, to explore music in a different way. She replied with a simple, respectful acceptance, agreeing to meet him in the hall the following week. The day of the meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the music hall was different from the night of her performance. There was no audience this time, only the two pianists and the quiet echo of the hall itself. She walked in first, moving with calm, deliberate steps, her fingers brushing lightly over the piano keys as she approached. She set up her music and waited, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the city beyond the walls. The famous pianist arrived shortly after, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. Yet she did not flinch. She acknowledged him with a small nod, and they both took their places near the piano. Ready to begin, they started with simple exercises, warming up their hands and sharing brief smiles over the familiarity of scales and arpeggios. There was no competition yet, only mutual observation and understanding. The famous pianist noticed the elegance of her posture, the calm assurance in her movements, and the ease with which her fingers touched the keys. He was aware of his own skill, of course, but watching her made him see music differently, as though he were discovering new dimensions in a landscape he thought he already knew. As they progressed, they began to play pieces together, passing melodies back and forth in a quiet, intricate dialogue. Each note was a conversation, each pause a moment of reflection. The young pianist had an intuitive sense of timing and expression that surprised even him. Her interpretation of the music was not learned from textbooks or teachers, but seemed to emerge naturally from her connection to the instrument. He found himself adjusting his own style to match her phrasing, finding beauty in the simplicity of her approach. Realizing that technical skill alone could never capture what she brought to the music, they experimented with different styles, from classical pieces to more modern compositions. At times, he would play a complex passage, expecting her to follow precisely, only to find her responding with a subtle variation that added depth and emotion he hadn't considered. He was both challenged and inspired, forced to rethink assumptions he had held for years. It was exhilarating and humbling, and he felt a rare spark of joy that came from learning rather than performing. During one particularly quiet moment, they paused, and he looked at her with genuine curiosity. He asked about her training, her inspirations, and how she approached the music. She spoke softly, explaining that she listened more than she practiced, that she observed life and allowed the music to come through her rather than forcing it. She described the hours spent alone, the way she connected with melodies and harmonies in a deeply personal way. He listened, realizing that her philosophy of music was as remarkable as her technical ability. It was a lesson in patience, presence, and authenticity. The session continued for hours, the room filled with music that seemed to bend time. Neither of them kept track of the clock, absorbed as they were in the exploration of sound, rhythm, and emotion. When they finally paused, it was with mutual recognition that something important had occurred. They had not played to compete, nor to impress, but to connect, to share the language of music in its purest form. The famous pianist felt a deep respect growing within him, a sense of having met someone truly extraordinary, and the young pianist felt a quiet affirmation of her path, knowing that her approach to music was valid, powerful, and deeply felt. As they packed up and prepared to leave the hall, he paused and said simply, "I've never experienced anything like this before." She smiled gently, offering no response beyond a nod. understanding that the music had spoken for both of them. Outside, the city continued its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken place within the walls of the hall. Yet both pianists knew that their encounter would linger in their minds and their music for a long time. It was the beginning of a connection, a mutual respect that would shape their understanding of music and the way they approached their craft. The young pianist walked home, her steps light, her mind calm. She reflected on the session, on the way music had been a bridge between her and someone she had once seen as distant and unapproachable. It had been a meeting of minds, of hearts, of passion for something beyond words. She realized that talent was only part of the journey. Understanding, listening, and connecting were equally important, and somewhere in the quiet of her apartment, she felt this sense of anticipation, a gentle excitement for what was yet to come, knowing that this was only the first step in a story that had only just begun. The following week, the young pianist returned to the music hall, this time for a small gathering of local musicians and students who had heard about her previous performance. The hall was quieter than before, with a handful of people scattered across the seats, but the atmosphere felt charged with curiosity and expectation. The famous pianist had agreed to come again, not to compete, but to witness her play in a slightly different setting and perhaps to share his own insights. As she approached the piano, she noticed him already seated in the back, his posture relaxed but attentive. He gave her a small nod, an acknowledgement that spoke more than words ever could. She smiled faintly and sat down, letting her fingers hover just above the keys, feeling the familiar hum of the instrument beneath them. The room held its breath, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself had slowed, waiting for her to begin. She started with a simple melody, one that seemed almost humble compared to the complexity she could achieve. But as she played, the room began to change. The notes carried a warmth that wrapped around the listeners, pulling them into a story they didn't yet understand. Every pause, every soft touch of the keys, felt deliberate, as if she were speaking to each person individually through the piano. The famous pianist leaned forward, listening intently, already aware that this performance would reveal layers he hadn't yet seen. Gradually, she built on the melody, adding subtle harmonies and gentle flourishes that elevated the music without overwhelming it. The simplicity of the beginning made the growth even more striking. The audience, small as it was, began to lean closer, drawn into the unfolding journey of sound. She didn't rush, she let each phrase breathe, letting the music find its natural path. It was a lesson in patience and presence, a reminder that mastery wasn't about speed or volume, but about intention and feeling. The famous pianist felt an unexpected mix of admiration and challenge rising within him. He had played countless pieces at the highest levels, but watching her shape music with such effortless grace made him question his own assumptions. It wasn't that he doubted his skill. He simply recognized that talent could take forms he hadn't considered. Each note she played carried a confidence that wasn't loud or demanding, but quietly undeniable. He realized that tonight, he was not just observing her performance, he was learning from it. As she moved into a more intricate piece, the audience could sense the depth of her understanding. She navigated complex passages with a calm fluidity that made difficult sequences seem natural. It was clear that she had internalized her training in a way that allowed her to focus on expression rather than struggle. Every chord had meaning. Every rise and fall of the melody conveyed emotion. The hall seemed to vibrate with a resonance that went beyond the physical sound of the piano. A few students in the audience whispered to one another, amazed by her control and creativity. They had studied music for years, learned technique and theory, yet here was someone who embodied the music itself, making it alive and personal. Even the more experienced musicians nodded quietly, recognizing a rare gift that couldn't be taught in lessons or copied from others. The young pianist's playing demanded attention, not because it was flashy, but because it was authentic and alive. The famous pianist decided to join her in an impromptu duet. He adjusted his sheet music and began playing a counter melody that intertwined with hers. At first, their music moved in careful synchronization, each listening closely to the other. Then, slowly, they began to respond to one another more intuitively, trading ideas and embellishments as if they were speaking in a language only they could understand. The hall felt suspended in a moment of pure collaboration, where ego and competition were set aside, and only the music mattered. As the duet progressed, subtle surprises emerged. The young pianist introduced variations that the famous pianist had not anticipated, small flourishes that added richness and depth. He responded, adapting his own playing to match her creativity. Together, they created a harmony that neither could have achieved alone, a living dialogue of sound that was both delicate and powerful. The students and musicians in the audience watched in awe, realizing they were witnessing not just a performance, but a moment of true artistic connection. After a particularly soft and lingering note, the young pianist paused, allowing the sound to fade naturally into silence. The hall remained still for several moments, the audience caught in a collective breath of admiration. Then, applause began, slow and hesitant at first, growing into genuine warmth and appreciation. It wasn't the loud, forced clapping of a competition, it was recognition of something rare, something that touched the heart rather than dazzled the eyes. The famous pianist stayed quiet, absorbing the performance fully before joining in the applause. He realized that this young pianist's strength lay not just in her skill, but in her ability to connect with people through music. She had an innate understanding of how to communicate emotion, how to tell a story, and how to make even a small audience feel as though they were part of something larger. It was a reminder that true mastery is not measured by trophies or titles, but by the impact one can have on others. After the performance, they sat together at the piano, discussing the music and sharing insights. He asked questions about her approach, her thought process while playing, and how she decided which variations to introduce. She spoke openly, describing how she listened carefully to the music and allowed it to guide her, how she tried to stay present in each moment and respond naturally to the sounds around her. He nodded thoughtfully, taking in her perspective and realizing that her philosophy was as important as her technical ability. As the evening continued, they experimented with different styles, trying pieces they hadn't played before. Each session was a mix of teaching and learning, of sharing and discovering. The young pianist found herself inspired by his experience, while he was inspired by her intuition and depth. The music became a bridge between generations, between experience and fresh insight. It was a rare collaboration that went beyond performance and entered the realm of mutual growth. When the gathering ended, the audience lingered, asking questions, seeking advice, and expressing admiration. The young pianist answered politely, but without ego, her focus remaining on the music rather than on herself. The famous pianist, observing her, felt a profound respect and a sense of humility. He had set out to observe, perhaps to challenge, but he left with a sense of gratitude for having witnessed something extraordinary. Outside the hall, the evening air was cool, and the city lights reflected in the puddles on the streets. The young pianist walked home slowly, reflecting on the session. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had shared her music authentically and had connected with someone whose experience could help her grow. She understood that learning and performing were not separate, they were part of the same journey. Music was not just an art form, it was a living, breathing experience that required both courage and openness. The famous pianist returned to his hotel, replaying the evening in his mind. He realized that he had underestimated the power of simplicity and authenticity in music. Talent alone could impress, but connection and emotion could inspire. He thought about the young pianist's calm confidence, her willingness to listen and respond rather than dominate, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that he would seek opportunities to learn from her, to explore music in ways he hadn't before. Their collaboration had opened doors to possibilities neither had imagined. As the night deepened, both pianists sat alone, each reflecting on the same session from different perspectives. They had not competed, they had not sought victory, yet they had both been challenged, inspired, and transformed. The young pianist felt affirmed in her approach, strengthened by the recognition and collaboration. The famous pianist felt humbled and motivated, aware that true artistry was a lifelong journey of learning and discovery. And in that quiet, both understood that music, in its purest form, could unite, teach, and move people in ways that nothing else could. A few days after the gathering at the music hall, word of the young pianist's extraordinary talent had spread quietly but steadily. Musicians and enthusiasts alike spoke of her ability to transform simple melodies into deeply moving experiences. Though she had never sought attention or recognition, her performances began to attract those who valued music for its true essence. She remained humble, treating every note as part of a conversation with the instrument and the listener, rather than a means to show off. The famous pianist, now more intrigued than ever, suggested they participate in a public recital together. He wanted the young pianist to experience playing in front of a larger audience, but more than that, he wanted to see how her music could inspire others on a bigger stage. She agreed, though she felt a quiet nervousness. Public performances were always different from private sessions. The stakes were higher, and the energy of a crowd could influence the music in unpredictable ways. But she trusted her abilities and knew that authenticity and focus were the key to connecting with an audience. On the day of the recital, the hall was packed. People had traveled from nearby towns, drawn by the buzz surrounding the young pianist. The famous pianist had assured her that it would be a supportive environment, but as she looked at the sea of faces, a mixture of excitement and tension filled her chest. She reminded herself to breathe, to let the music flow naturally, and to listen to the energy in the room rather than trying to control it. The recital began with the famous pianist playing a few solo pieces. His mastery and experience were evident, and the audience responded with warmth and appreciation. When it was the young pianist's turn, the room fell into a hushed anticipation. She sat at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, and closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then, she began to play. At first, the music was soft, almost tentative, but it quickly grew in confidence and clarity. The melody unfolded gently, weaving through the hall like a delicate thread connecting every listener to the piano. She didn't try to impress anyone. She simply allowed the music to flow through her. Each note was intentional, each pause meaningful. The audience was captivated, drawn into a story that required no words, only the language of sound. The famous pianist watched from the side, feeling a mixture of pride and astonishment. He had seen many talented performers, but the young pianist's ability to command the attention of a large audience with quiet strength was extraordinary. She did not rely on speed or complexity alone. She played with emotion, nuance, and a deep understanding of the music's essence. Her performance was not just a display of skill, but a demonstration of heart and intuition, qualities that could not be learned from books or teachers alone. As she moved into a more challenging piece, the audience leaned in, fully engaged. She navigated intricate passages with grace, her fingers dancing across the keys with precision, yet never losing the emotional thread that tied the music together. It was clear that every note had been chosen with care, every phrase shaped to communicate meaning beyond the technical execution. The hall seemed to hold its breath, each listener suspended in the moment, carried along by the unfolding music. Somewhere in the middle of the performance, she began to improvise slightly, letting her instincts guide her hands in a spontaneous dialogue with the instrument. The audience responded instinctively, sensing the authenticity and courage behind each variation. The famous pianist felt a thrill of excitement, realizing that she was not only performing the music, but also transforming it, making it her own in real time. He recognized that this was a rare gift, the ability to balance mastery with creativity, discipline with intuition. As the final notes resonated through the hall, there was a brief moment of silence. The audience was caught between awe and anticipation, reluctant to break the spell that had been woven. Then, applause erupted, loud and heartfelt. It was not just appreciation for technical skill, but gratitude for the emotional journey they had experienced. People stood, some with tears in their eyes, moved by the depth and sincerity of her performance. The young pianist stood and acknowledged the audience with a modest bow. She felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had communicated what she intended, without needing to exaggerate or perform for effect. Behind her, the famous pianist joined in the applause, his face reflecting both admiration and respect. He had been challenged once again, not by competition, but by the realization that true artistry could take forms he had never fully appreciated. After the recital, musicians and audience members approached her, eager to share their reactions, ask questions, or simply express their admiration. She listened politely, offering thoughtful responses, always keeping the focus on the music rather than herself. The famous pianist observed quietly, impressed by her grace and composure. He realized that her strength lay not only in her talent, but also in her humility, and her ability to remain grounded, even in moments of recognition and praise. Later, when the hall was empty, the two pianists stayed behind, exploring the nuances of their performance together. They played side by side, exchanging ideas, experimenting with dynamics, and refining interpretations. Their collaboration had grown stronger, based not on rivalry, but on mutual respect and curiosity. Each session was a conversation, a shared exploration of sound and emotion, where both could learn and inspire each other. The young pianist reflected on the day as she walked home through the quiet streets. The night air was cool and refreshing, and she felt a sense of calm accomplishment. She had faced a larger audience, shared her music authentically, and connected with both the listeners and her mentor in a meaningful way. It was a reminder that music was more than practice or performance. It was about communication, understanding, and presence. The famous pianist returned to his hotel, replaying the recital in his mind. He felt a renewed sense of purpose and inspiration, understanding that mastery alone was not enough. The young pianist had reminded him of the importance of listening, of presence, and of connecting deeply with the music and the audience. He recognized that their ongoing collaboration would continue to challenge and enrich both of them, expanding their understanding of what music could achieve. As the city slept, both pianists sat quietly in their own spaces, reflecting on the experiences of the day. The young pianist felt affirmed in her approach, strengthened by the validation of her talent and the collaboration she had shared. The famous pianist felt invigorated, aware that he had been given an opportunity to see music through fresh eyes, to learn lessons he hadn't anticipated. Both understood that the journey was ongoing, that each performance, each session, was a step in a lifelong pursuit of expression, connection, and growth. The day had ended, but the music lingered. The melodies, the emotions, the shared understanding, they all continued to resonate in their minds and hearts. The young pianist knew that every note she played was part of a larger story, and the famous pianist recognized that even the most accomplished artist could be inspired and challenged by genuine talent. In that quiet night, both understood the power of music to move, connect, and transform, and the anticipation of future performances filled them with excitement and purpose. Weeks passed since the public recital, and the young pianist's reputation had quietly grown. She was no longer just a local talent. Musicians from other cities began to notice her, drawn by stories of her ability to transform simple melodies into profound emotional experiences. She, however, remained focused on her practice, mindful of the discipline and presence that had brought her this far. Fame was never her goal. Music, in its purest form, had always been her guide. The famous pianist continued to collaborate with her, and their sessions became more frequent and deeper in exploration. Each meeting was a blend of learning and sharing, with neither trying to dominate or impress the other. Instead, they treated each session as a dialogue, where every note and every pause could communicate something beyond words. He had grown to respect her not only as a musician, but also as a teacher of sorts, someone who reminded him of the emotional depth and authenticity often overlooked. In the pursuit of technical perfection, one afternoon, he suggested they prepare for a small concert where they would perform together, blending their unique styles into a single harmonious experience. The young pianist agreed, though she felt a quiet tension. Performing together for a wider audience would be a different challenge, one that required not only skill but deep trust and understanding. Yet she knew that such experiences were where growth happened, where music became more than individual expression and turned into shared energy. The day of the concert arrived. The hall was filled with people who had come to witness something extraordinary. Students, musicians, and enthusiasts filled every seat, and the energy in the room was palpable. Backstage, the young pianist felt a familiar calm wash over her. She reminded herself to breathe, to listen to the piano, to let the music guide her. The famous pianist gave her a small, encouraging nod, and she smiled in return. There was no competition here, only collaboration, and that understanding gave her confidence. They began the performance with a piece composed by the famous pianist, known for its intricate passages and emotive depth. She followed his lead, adding subtle nuances that enhanced the overall expression. The audience listened intently, drawn into the seamless dialogue between the two musicians. It was a dance of sound, with each note complementing the other, each pause filled with meaning. The young pianist's touch was gentle yet commanding, and together, they created a musical experience that felt both grand and intimate. As they transitioned into a piece chosen by the young pianist, the audience sensed a shift in energy. Her interpretation was deeply personal, expressive, and unexpectedly bold. She introduced subtle improvisations that intertwined with the structured composition, creating a texture that was both familiar and new. The famous pianist responded intuitively, weaving his own variations around hers, their music flowing effortlessly. It was clear that the collaboration was no longer just about performing. It had become an exploration of possibilities, a conversation through sound. The audience was captivated. Every note seemed to carry emotion. Every phrase revealed the musician's connection to the music and to each other. Some listeners were visibly moved, leaning forward in their seats, eyes closed, completely absorbed in the experience. Others whispered quietly to neighbors, sharing their awe at the unexpected brilliance unfolding before them. The hall was filled with a collective sense of wonder, a recognition that they were witnessing something rare and extraordinary. Midway through the performance, a more challenging section approached. The music demanded precision, coordination, and deep understanding of timing. The young pianist's fingers moved swiftly across the keys, her concentration absolute. The famous pianist matched her every note, sometimes anticipating, sometimes responding, creating a dynamic interplay that was thrilling to watch. It was a moment of shared mastery, where experience met intuition, discipline met inspiration, and together, they elevated the music beyond the sum of its parts. As the final notes resonated through the hall, there was a brief, suspended silence. The audience seemed reluctant to break the spell, holding their collective breath for a moment longer. Then, applause erupted, spontaneous and overwhelming. People stood, clapping, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. It was not simply admiration for technical skill. It was an acknowledgement of the emotional journey they had been taken on. The connection forged through music between the performers and the listeners. The young pianist stood and bowed, her expression calm yet filled with quiet satisfaction. She felt the resonance of the audience's reaction but remained grounded, knowing that the music itself had spoken louder than words ever could. The famous pianist joined her in the bow, his smile reflecting genuine respect and pride. He understood that this performance was a milestone, not for recognition, but for the shared experience, the dialogue, and the authenticity they had achieved together. After the concert, musicians and audience members approached them, eager to share their thoughts and express their appreciation. The young pianist listened carefully, offering thoughtful responses while keeping the focus on the music. The famous pianist observed, impressed by her humility and composure. He realized that true artistry was not just about skill or fame, but about connecting with others, sharing vulnerability through music, and staying true to one's own voice. Later, alone in the hall, the two pianists sat at the piano, reflecting on the performance and exploring new ideas. They experimented with blending styles, developing new interpretations, and discovering unexpected harmonies. The room, empty now, was filled with possibility and creativity. Each note was a discovery, each phrase a conversation. Their collaboration had grown deeper, transforming from admiration into mutual understanding and respect. Walking home that night, the young pianist felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She understood that her journey was ongoing, that every performance, every practice session, every collaboration was part of a lifelong pursuit of growth and expression. The applause and recognition, though gratifying, were secondary to the connection she felt with the music, and with those who experienced it alongside her. The famous pianist returned to his own space, replaying the evening in his mind. He felt renewed, inspired, and deeply appreciative of having witnessed and participated in something extraordinary. He had sought to challenge, to observe, and to engage, but he found himself transformed, reminded of the beauty and power of authenticity in music. He understood that the young pianist had not only met his challenge, but had exceeded it, teaching him lessons in presence, expression, and humility. In the quiet of the night, both pianists reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had started as mentor and observer, as challenger and challenged, yet their connection had grown into a shared exploration of music's potential. They had discovered that true artistry was not about competition or acclaim, but about dialogue, understanding, and the courage to let music speak through them honestly and deeply. The young pianist continued to practice, perform, and grow, guided by her dedication, intuition, and passion. The famous pianist remained by her side in mentorship and collaboration, learning as much from her as she had from him. Together, they had created a space where music could thrive, touch hearts, and inspire, proving that the power of talent combined with authenticity and connection could leave an unforgettable mark on all who experienced it. Their story, one of quiet brilliance and mutual respect, continued to unfold. It was a testament to the idea that music was more than notes on a page or applause from a crowd. It was a living, breathing language of emotion, connection, and shared humanity. And as both pianists moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that every performance, every collaboration, every melody played with heart and presence, could resonate far beyond the hall, touching lives in ways that words alone could never achieve.